at the Louisiana, and it's quite a remarkable book. It includes all of the court cases, major court cases in the Florida struggle, as well as various letters and other public documents from Catherine Harris and other key players. When we stop laughing about Catherine Harris, somehow that changed our politics as well. And the second half of the book is really a remarkable collection of commentary on the election. Op-ed pieces, longer magazine articles, and because you have two editors of distinctly separate or opposed political views, the selection is really, I have to say, remarkable. So this was put out very quickly by the folks at the Brookings Institution, and I think we're supposed to have some of them, some copies here. In any event, if you are interested in this, and I take it by your presence here that you are, buy this book. It's very useful. This is a conversation, and I thought we would begin this afternoon, before we get to the ins and outs and intricacies of what happened in Florida itself, by talking a little about where Florida is now. I'm talking about not the state, but the state of mind, as it were. That is, are we here today to talk about ancient history, something that's gone and finished, that is interesting now from a historian's point of view, who presumably will place this election along with 1824, 1876, and 1888 is one of these bad, complicated, struggling elections? Or does it live in our politics as we speak? EJ and I were talking last night about President Bush's rather low approval rating, much lower than you would normally expect for a president at this time. And I wonder, how do you think we're seeing Florida emerging in our politics now, or at least living in our politics now? What happened in Florida?
Should I take the mic? Or should we go back and forth?
No, it's okay. It's fine.
You can hear it?
It's fine.
First of all, thank you all for coming. You confirm a theory which I keep telling people, which is there really are a lot of people who still care about what happened in Florida. I took, for those of you who read my column, I took a rather strong stance and decided that I had become the Dear Abby of angry Democrats. And I hear from a lot of people, God bless them, who still feel strongly about this. And I think that this is a live political issue. And what I'd like to do is, first of all, just thank you, Mark, for what you said about the book. This was actually one of the most fun projects I've ever done. And I had this idea that this should be debated for a long time to come. And I also thought, simply as a matter of, for academic reasons, I think this case is going to be of a lot of interest to students for a long time to come. And so I had this idea for this book, and then I said to the editors, if I am the sole editor, we lose half our audience. So I called my friend Bill Bristol, conservative whom I greatly respect and disagree with on a great many things. And I basically said, Bill, you can pick the wrong-headed stuff, I'll pick the right-minded stuff. I promise you we won't label it that way. And so we actually had a lot of fun. And what struck me, I appreciate what Mark said, what struck me at the time is you could tell this was a special moment because the engagement of people, the engagement of this commentary, and the engagement of some of the most serious philosophers, law professors, political scientists in the debate. I mean, this is a popular book, and yet it is also an academic book because there are so many smart academic voices who join this debate. So I think it will live in that respect for certain. My theory is that there is going on now a very peculiar legitimacy war in the country between the two parties. And I think Democrats, a very large number of Democrats, it goes much beyond, people talk a lot about African Americans, and they are very important in the reaction to Florida. They talk about the Democratic base, but in my experience, the group is larger than that. It includes a whole lot of moderate Democrats who were angry either about the Bush tactics or especially about what the Supreme Court did, or both. And I think there is this very large group that believes fundamentally that George Bush lost the election, and in a few cases, if he didn't lose the election, he sure didn't win it in a way where we would know that he won the election. We get to this issue of the Miami Herald recount in a moment. And so I think that for these Democrats in the rank and file are willing to say what many Democrats who hold public office do not want to say. They are willing directly to raise the issue of Bush's legitimacy. On the Republican side, I think there is a comparable war going on, and that is to delegitimize the Clinton presidency. Now, Clinton has done an awfully good job, as he often does, of helping his enemies with the Mark Rich party. And I always said that everybody knew Clinton felt people's pain, but people didn't realize he even felt Bob Barr's pain and provided him with something to attack him with after he left office with exceptionally high approval ratings. But I think what you're seeing in this fight over Rich is one last re-education campaign on the Clinton presidency. And it's the last shot to say, even though people disagreed that he should be impeached, even though people on balance thought he had done a good job as president, wasn't he really wretched, and wasn't it time, is it a time for us to decide as a country that this really was a fundamentally illegitimate presidency? That suggests an extraordinary time of party feeling that I think we're going to see playing out over the next 4 years. It doesn't mean that the Florida recount will be in your face every day. It doesn't even mean, despite what cable television will want to do, that Bill Clinton will be in your face in 2 years, although sometimes I wonder. And that these stories about Clinton will go on. But I think there will be a kind of constant, that each of these events, Florida and Clinton, the various Clinton events, will become almost part of a political tradition in the country. And I think what's interesting about this time is that it does resemble the time around that last great disputed election that involved Florida, 1876. And that too was a period in which the country was divided almost 50-50 between the two political parties. It was a time of intense party feeling. It's important to say intense party feeling does not necessarily mean there are vast differences between the parties. In the periods 1876 to 1896, when you had the parties that were up parity, in many elections the differences weren't that vast. They had to do more with traditions about the Civil War than they did about current issues, and the Republican Party after 1876 really backed away from its commitment, slowly backed away from its commitment to African Americans in the South. So that big difference between the parties actually began to narrow, and yet it was still a time of intense partisan feeling. And I think that Florida is one of those events, and I also think it will play back into current debates. I think that there is a big question about how Bush should have handled this victory. Should he have acted as he is now doing, as if he had a mandate? Or should he have responded to the fact that even aside from Florida, he actually lost the popular vote, and did that put obligations upon him to act in a certain way? He clearly doesn't believe that. I think a lot of people, not just Democrats, believe he should have.
Well, it's interesting. I think the obligation to act in a certain way is being treated in two ways by Bush and by the Bush administration. That is, in public, the talk, the rhetoric about bipartisanship and about establishing a new tone in Washington, which dominated the campaign, has continued, and the president's very, very interested in repeating that whenever he appears publicly. And yet the political strategy that's being played out by the administration really emphasizes no compromise. And there's an interesting story in the Washington Post today about how angry Democrats in Congress are becoming because of the techniques that Republicans are using, notably in the House. But I'd like to comment a bit about the Bush, and I think about the Rich pardon and the way it's been treated now. And to me, it's connected quite a bit with what was one of the surprising things I found in this book. A lot of the commentary, the wrong-headed commentary, as you called it.
Some of it's very smart, by the way.
Some of it's very smart. But I was fascinated by early on, right after the election, in the days right after the election, when people really had no notion that this would go on for 5 weeks, the tone of the Weekly Standard and other conservative voices heated up very, very quickly. And one of the interesting things to me about it was the connection almost immediately to what Gore was doing in Florida to the Clinton, to the impeachment, essentially. That these issues, the impeachment, Florida, and now the Rich pardon, seem to me very much connected in our politics. And when I look at the way the Rich pardon has been covered, I don't know how many people in here spend much of their time watching the cable TV political shows, MSNBC, Fox, to some extent CNN, which are more and more, I think, driving our public politics. it seems to me what needs to be explained about how the rich pardon is covered and the dominance of Clinton still as a public figure is the superfluity. That is the incredible amount of coverage, the incredible anger. And I certainly agree that part of that comes from concerns about legitimacy. That is the public rhetoric, and I agree with you, Jay, about the pardon. The pardon was very misguided. But the public rhetoric has very much to do with staining the presidency, damaging the presidency, delegitimizing the presidency, which is something that I think is very much in the minds of Republicans with their awareness that of people's constant awareness of what happened in the last election. And you see, one of the interesting things, the LA Times today had a public opinion poll that showed Bush, I think for the first time, over 60% in his public approval. His numbers have been very low for a recently elected president, extremely low, in fact, in the mid-50s, I think. And it's clear that one of the reasons for that certainly is the Florida overhang. I'd like to get, at the end of our discussion, come back to the issue of how Florida is persisting in our politics. But
could I pick up on just something
absolutely.
you said, and then I want to, because I'd like to then you to go back and maybe talk about counterfactuals, how could the thing have been different?
Mm-hmm.
But I just, in terms of the commentary, one of the interesting things about putting this book together and going back and looking at the commentary is that it took a very long time for Democrats as a party and also for, if you will, liberal opinion to rally behind Gore. And that, there are people who have said that, the Republicans in the end really wanted to win this election more than the Democrats did. And I think there were several different things going on there. I think, it is true that Republicans desperately wanted to win this election, and that Clinton, there is something called the Clinton disease that creates an intense reaction in Republicans, and they had it, and it motivated them. And it motivated them to a level of attack on Gore that was not matched at all by what the Democrats were doing to Bush at that moment. Eventually,
Are you talking about after the election? Or
I'm talking about after the election, in the early period after the election, when the election was in doubt. The Democrats did launch some tough attacks eventually against Katherine Harris, but they did not really unload on Bush the way Republicans unloaded on Gore. Secondly, I think within the Democratic Party, there were a lot of people who just never really liked Al Gore that much, were mad at him for the kind of campaign he ran, for the fact that he'd even gotten to this point in Florida. And indeed, some of Gore's people I have talked to said the problem with Florida is not just what happened in Florida, but the fact that we even got there. And of course, it's got to keep Al Gore up at night that if he had spent about $100,000 more on WMUR TV in Manchester, New Hampshire, and had carried New Hampshire, Florida wouldn't have mattered. But I think there was not a strong feeling of solidarity with Gore in the party, and therefore it took the longest time for people to rally around. And then finally there was the effect of the network calling the networks calling the election for Bush, and that's a strange event that I hope will get more. People will sort of look at more, because I was working that night at National Public Radio with my friend, another of my Weekly Standard arguing comrades, David Brooks, and we were watching the vote coming out of Florida. It was very clear from looking at the screens that the missing votes were largely from Democratic areas, not from Republican areas. And so I was stunned. As it turns out, a lot of other people who were looking at those numbers were stunned when they made that call for Bush. And I think Gore never fully recovered from that, because it laid a predicate for the whole argument, and it created the sense among Republicans that he really was trying to steal the election. Gore, by calling for a recount. It really took at least a couple of weeks. I think every time Jim Baker had a news conference, support for Gore went up. I think that, and I see that's correct. I think that there was a kind of ferocity in the rhetoric, and I also think the Bush side was hurt by this odd combination of total hardball politics, which I can understand and respect, sort of underneath a layer of angry moralism suggesting that it was Gore trying to steal the election. I think if it had been pure hardball politics without the other piece, Democrats and lots of other people would not have been as angry. They would have accepted this as normal recount politics. Gore didn't start getting real support until about the last week or a week and a half, 2 weeks of the controversy?
Well, I think after Miami, after the so-called, I think it was actually your friend David Brooks who called it the bourgeois riot in Miami-Dade, which happened outside of the vote tabulation on the 19th floor, actually, of the Stephen Clark office building. I think after that happened, a lot of people in Washington got very angry, or more motivated, certainly. And I remember that, wasn't there a picture, I think, appeared of the bourgeois rioters in the elevator area of the 19th floor. I think it was in the Washington Post, where it identified all of the people in the picture as, you know, people coming essentially from Washington, who, you know, some of them famously worked for Tom DeLay and others. But I think that solidified support for him, definitely. Also, as you say, I mean, Gore, I think, was never quite so popular within the Democratic Party, certainly the Democratic Party in Washington. But I want to go back to your point that the television, the early call by first Fox and then the other networks early on the morning after the election at about 2:08 or 2:07 a.m., essentially established a position that never really changed through the fight. And that was, Bush essentially was, in chess terms, he was playing white. You know, he was the aggressive one, he was in the lead. And he also, because he was in the lead, got to play defense and got to essentially use the law to try to, in fact, run out the clock. And he, in the end, was successful in that. We were talking last night, EJ and I, about counterfactuals. That is, at what point in this struggle, that is after the election, could things have been different? How could they have been played differently? Because, I mean, at least from my point of view, I've always thought that the only equitable outcome for both sides would have been a hand recount throughout the state, not just of undervotes, but of overvotes as well. And that is the count that's now being attempted, at least, by the so-called consortium. This is a group of media companies, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and others, who are now going around the state counting all of the under and overvotes. The question is, could Gore have made that decision early on, that is to demand a recount throughout the state, in every county, a hand recount? Could he have started making that claim from the day after election, and could he have pressed that claim and been eventually successful? That is, could he have brought political pressure to bear in such a way that Bush eventually would have felt pressure to agree to it? I think at the time, in these hairy days, and it's really a remarkable story when you think about it, that these campaigns, which, you know, these people have been struggling and fighting and campaigning round the clock. In particular, Gore was, Bush actually went back and went to sleep and had some rest in Austin. But Gore typically was campaigning around the clock, sleep deprived, all the rest, and thinking, you know, here you are, you think, well, finally we've reached this point after a struggle going on for years, that we're going to know the answer tonight. And then suddenly the answer isn't there. And when you look at the story of how these people mobilized themselves, got, you know, hired law firms, chartered a plane, and I think Gore had a plane leaving at something like 4 or 4:30 election night, you know, the next morning, going to Florida with his troops. When you think of how this happened and how quickly it happened, and the pressure under which they made decisions, it's not surprising they perhaps made some misjudgments. But it's clear that Gore early on thought, played by what we've talked about, played by the book, that is classic recount rules. Classic recount rules suggest that you try to ask for recounts within counties where you think you're going to pick up votes. That is, it's an adversary procedure. One side, Gore, tries to have recounts in counties where he'll pick up votes. Bush is playing defense and says no recounts. And that's essentially the way the whole thing came down until the Florida Supreme Court handed down its decision to have a statewide count, and then the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, stayed it. The question I have is, could Gore early on, he was clearly afraid to seem to be prolonging this process. That is, how long will this go on? We have to get it done within a few days. The idea of asking for recounts statewide would certainly have, you know, seemed perhaps unreasonable at the time. But what I'd like to, you know, throw out on the table is, could he have tried to pursue that strategy, and would it eventually have worked?
And yeah, and my view is that it was the right thing to do, and I'm not at all sure that it would have been successful. Just to go back, I always felt that, and wrote on the Thursday after the election, that what we really needed to do as a country was to have Bush and Gore sit down and agree on a plan to count the state, and that it would have been much better for the legitimacy of either person's presidency to reach agreement on counting the state. And what was odd to me about this whole controversy is we've had recounts all over this country where candidates have agreed, yes, this is a close election, we're going to fight each other for every single vote, but we will recount all the votes. And I think in the long run, we will always regret that we just didn't do that. And to me, I'm an opinionated columnist now, but I came out of old-fashioned journalism, and to me it was always a question of full disclosure and public knowledge. And what could be wrong with transparency and counting all the votes in public? Isn't that what we always tell emerging democracies to do? And we don't need to go into all the jokes about America as emerging democracy as a result of this circumstance. But it just struck me that as a country that always stood for democracy in the world, that would have been the example to set. I agree that the statewide recount would have been good. It strikes me, if you go back to that period, critical period after the election, Gore was really getting no breaks. You know, and it's worth noting, I mean, you had kind of Gore under siege, if you will, both from a little bit to his right in the sort of establishment press, which was kind of uneasy. Even people who were supporting Gore were kind of uneasy about, is this, you know, is this going too far? Will the country won't be able to take the delay? It turned out the country did just fine with the delay. And then obviously you had on the left, I mean, there were 2.5 million votes for Ralph Nader. The left had never been fans of Gore, so he wasn't getting support there. Interestingly, as time went on, that support did fall into place, and there are a lot of people on the left who are angry about the election. I know, including people who voted for Nader, that some other folks are. It just seems to me that if he had done that, he might have been attacked for, going too far and demanding something that shouldn't have happened. Now, you could say in retrospect that still would have been the better thing to do. But the test, I think, is when he did do that and Bush refused, there was no great revolt on the editorial pages that had called for statewide recount.
I disagree with this because when he eventually did it, it was more than a week after the election. And his proposal, that is to count statewide, was joined with a promise that if Bush agreed to this, Gore would drop all his lawsuits. So it essentially came out as a stratagem. Look, why don't we count statewide, and if you agree to this, I'm going to drop my lawsuits. It seemed to me at that point it was a proposal that was really, that the Bush side took to be completely for public relations value, that there was no chance that Bush would agree to this. I mean, the key question, of course, in what we're talking about is, would Bush ever have had an incentive? I mean, even he was ahead by more than 1,700. There was the automatic recount. He was ahead by 327, I think. Would he ever have had an incentive to agree to a recount throughout the state? And I think the only way he would have had an incentive is if Gore took that position early on, held to it, and kept thumping on it is the only fair way to find out who Floridians voted for, essentially. I think it's important to point out here a couple of things that I found out just in reporting from Florida. There was a lot of, in the coverage in the 5 weeks after the election, there was a lot of smoke, obviously. And some of the smoke had to do with, well, all elections are like this. You have these kind of mistakes in all elections. This always happens. Votes, as many votes were thrown out last time as this time. That's not true. Essentially, this time, about 3% of the ballots were thrown out in Florida, as opposed to slightly less than 2% across the country. In 1996, about 2.5% of the ballots were thrown out. So it was this considerable difference. Why was there this big difference? Why was Florida different in some ways? I think you can look at a number of reasons. One was the fact that the ballot was very crowded. There was an amendment passed in 1998 in Florida, and it's funny. The funny thing, this is another connection to the impeachment crisis. That while the impeachment crisis was happening in Washington, Floridians essentially voted to open up the ballot to presidential candidates, the third parties. So in 1996, you had 4 candidates on the ballot in Florida. In 2010, 10 presidential candidates. which meant that in Palm Beach County, Teresa Lepore decided to do the butterfly ballot, so her constituents supposedly, could read this better. In Duval County, Jacksonville, they did a 2-page ballot. There was also an enormously increased turnout in Florida because of all the money that was pumped into the state, because of turnout efforts, particularly in the African American community. You had, I think there were 600,000 or 700,000 more Florida voters in 2000 than there were 4 years before. Black turnout went up 60%, extraordinary. And you had an enormous number of first-time voters. So you can combine inexperienced voters with a complicated ballot, and you have an enormous number of ballots that were thrown out. The interesting thing, when I think we should get to this maybe, the question of the recounts going on now, the Miami Herald is doing a statewide recount, but they're essentially counting undervotes. But the largest mistakes are probably included in the overvotes, that is ballots that were punched twice. Maybe we should talk about the recount for a second.
Let me just go back to one other
Sure.
alternative strategy Gore could have pursued, and this goes to the question of the overvotes and the problems with the Palm Beach ballot. Again, following classic recount strategy, the Gore campaign decided to narrow itself to demanding the recounts in those 4 counties, Volusia, Broward, Palm Beach, and Miami-Dade. In the process, they did a couple of things. They dropped challenges to the butterfly ballot. They didn't go after the votes thrown out in Duval County, where there was a lot of overvoting, especially in African American precincts. And then they didn't choose to, if you will, go with a mobilization strategy within the Democratic base, and in particular among African Americans. And I think this too, if the Republican side showed that there was a kind of anger and solidarity that kept the Republicans together, on the Democratic side, there were all sorts of divisions about what is the appropriate strategy, what will help the party more. If there were too many demonstrations, will that actually hurt our image? There was a kind of caution on the Gore side and a worry about what it meant to mobilize people, mobilize African Americans, mobilize the base, mobilize labor. Labor sent an enormous number of people down to Florida. There was that caution, I think, goes back to the sense that Gore was very worried about the lack of depth of support within those parts of the establishment that actually supported him. And so, again, looking back, you could say the Republicans pursued a more militant strategy, both on the ground, certainly on the ground. Illegally, I think they were both militant. And then Gore narrowed himself to these, these particular issues. And in retrospect,
why was he worried about losing support by demonstrations?
Because I think he was worried, in a funny way, I think they were still playing for swing voters. That there was a swing voter sense that, a figure such as Al Sharpton become the spokesman for the Gore effort. What does that do to public opinion on the recount? And I think it shows sort of the vexing nature of the Democratic coalition, because in Florida, the anger of African Americans came not just from the lousy voting equipment, but also from evidence that there had been, there were people who were thrown off the voter rolls. There were the people I like to call the phony felons, where the state hired a company that purged the voter rolls on the basis of who had been a felon in the past. I think 54% of those so purged were African Americans. It turned out not everybody on the list was a felon, but they didn't get back. They didn't get back on the voter rolls. But still, it's going to take time to know how many. But the numbers were significant. And of course, in an election this close, every number is significant. So again, I think you look back and you say, it's unclear to me what the right course was, but they chose, the Gore people chose the more cautious course.
The irony is that, I know one of the pieces in this book begins with a quotation from Al Gore. I think it's taken from Newsweek magazine, that the difference between us is that Bush, if he loses, will go back to his ranch and live a happy life. I, on the other hand, will do anything I need to win. This means everything.